So anyway, thank you, Greg, for the kind introduction. Thank you to FIRE for having me. I have admired the organization for so many years and appreciated its work, and so it really is a pleasure and an honor for me to appear before you tonight. I was an undergraduate at Harvard in the mid-90s, and we had our fair share of campus controversies, and FIRE co-founder Harvey Silverglate was often the voice of reason quoted in the Harvard Crimson on many of them. And then, in 1999, I graduated from law school, and 1999 happens to be the year that FIRE was founded. So I very much feel that my career has been coextensive with FIRE's life as an organization. And during this time, I think on the bright side, we have seen some amazing positive developments for free speech and free expression, namely the rise of the internet and social media. And I would not be a journalist and writer today if not for those things. I didn't work for a newspaper or a magazine. I was just a guy with a laptop in my apartment. I was a blogger. And really, my foray into writing and punditry came about because of this new medium that was made possible by technology. So on the one hand, I think we are living in a great time for free expression. But to echo what Greg just said, I think there are growing threats to free speech, academic freedom, and due process, which is why I feel FIRE's work is more important than ever. And it's also why I was very pleased to learn of FIRE's renaming and the expansion of its mission. I think it's really a wonderful thing, and there's no shortage of work out there to be done. That said, I suspect that in some ways academia will always be FIRE's first love. I don't think it's going to be abandoning its mission on campuses. And so that's why it's so wonderful to see all of you here tonight. After this weekend, you are going to be more well-equipped than ever to serve as both guardians of and evangelists for the values of free speech and the First Amendment. So today I'd like to talk about one area of academia that I happen to know well because I'm a lawyer by training and I write about law and the legal profession. I'm going to talk about one area of academia where I feel these values are sadly under attack, and that is American law schools. And there's a huge, huge irony to this, because we are very fortunate to live in a nation where our laws protect our free expression to a great, great degree. My family's originally from the Philippines, where journalists have been jailed and murdered, and we are so, so fortunate to live in a country like the one that we do. And also, I would add, law has been a great tool for fighting attempts to trample on free speech. Just look at FIRE's many, many courtroom successes over the years. So you would think, based on this, that US law schools would be in some ways the perfect environment for free expression, but that is sadly not the case. And FIRE has been kept very busy over the past few years. I'm going to recount some greatest hits of some problems with free speech on US law schools, and FIRE actually figures in many of them. I'm going to definitely try, and this is why I keep glancing at my cell phone here, I'm going to definitely try to leave a lot of time for questions though, because as somebody who writes about these issues, I want to hear what you are seeing as students who are in the trenches on campuses. And I really want to hear about the types of issues that you're facing on your campuses. And I'd also like to hear about the attitudes of your peers towards free speech, because whether or not we have reason at the end to be optimistic or not is really going to depend on you and your classmates. So I'm going to talk about three things tonight. First, I'm going to diagnose the problem at US law schools and look at the free speech situation. And my thesis, not surprisingly, is that US law schools have a serious free speech problem. Second, I'm going to explore the consequences of this problem. Why should we care? I get this a lot. I've been writing a lot about these issues and these fights over free speech on law school campuses, and sometimes people say, oh my gosh, another post about Yale Law School, like, can't you just give me some law firm bonus information? But really, this is stuff that matters greatly, and I'm going to explain why. And then in my third and final part, I'm going to talk about what can be done about this by administrators and also by you as students. Unfortunately, that's going to be a short, I'm sure this weekend is going to generate a lot of great ideas about what can be done. I guess what I'm trying to say is I come to this, as Greg was saying, I come to this with humility. I think that I wish I had more solutions for you, but at the same time, I think a lot of the solutions are going to be developed by you organically working on your campuses. So let me talk first about the state of free speech at US law schools. And I think it is admittedly hard to lend any kind of empirical rigor to this. FIRE does great work in terms of data data collection about, as Greg was mentioning, for example, actions taken against professors in higher education more generally. But it's not like there's some kind of handy index for free speech that we can apply to US law schools and say, well, in 1997 the index was X, and in 2022 the index is Y. So a lot of my thoughts are going to be anecdotal in nature, but I agree that in some ways, as somebody who's been in and around the legal profession for 25 years, if you count my time in law school, I have not seen it this bad, both within law schools and also the legal profession. I'm going to touch on the legal profession as well later on in my talk, even though mainly I'm talking about law schools. So it really is a very challenging time, and there is no shortage of work to be done. So the New York Times, in its staff editorial about free speech earlier this year, did some polling, and they found that 84% of adults said it is a very serious or somewhat serious problem that Americans do not speak freely in everyday situations because of fear of retaliation or harsh criticism. 84%, which is a very, very high number. And at the same time, I don't know if this really surprises any of us, because we're all engaging in self-censorship constantly. And I would say I engage in a lot more of it now than I did, say, 5 or 10 years ago. I'm guessing probably you do as well. I'm very active on Twitter. Follow me. But one thing about Twitter is I tweet a lot less than I do, because I don't want to take the abuse. But also, there's a lot of self-censorship going on. I actually try to be as courageous as I can, because I think one of the ways out of this problem is for us to have courage and to not be the silent minority on free speech, but a silent majority, but a vocal majority. But it is hard, because nobody likes to be abused, nobody likes to be called names, nobody likes, say, threats against your family or anything like that. And we are also very scared, I think, those of us who have a somewhat public or partially public life. Everyone feels that they're sort of one tweet away from cancellation. Sometimes I have my husband vet these things. Am I going to get canceled for this? Because it is a scary time to be a pundit or writer or somebody who puts your thoughts out there into the public. I think one of the issues with legal academia is there's a huge ideological skew. I think a lot of the problems we see in free expression happen in environments where there's one school of thought that dominates very heavily. It might be in a conservative state where they've passed an anti-CRT law, or it might be in a law school campus where the faculty and the student body are overwhelmingly to the left. In a 2018 paper entitled The Legal Academy's Ideological Uniformity, professors conducted surveys of faculty, and they found that only 15% of US law professors identify as conservative. Compare that to 35% of lawyers in the profession, which actually is roughly also the case in terms of Americans as a whole. So you see there's a big, big difference. And if you look at my alma mater, Yale Law School, you'll see an even bigger difference. In terms of professors of so-called public law, things like constitutional law, as opposed to things like, say, corporate law, there are a grand total of 0 conservatives in public law on the Yale Law School faculty today. Now, I will say that that hasn't necessarily been a new development. It was also largely the case when I was there in the 90s. But one thing that I do think is different is the tolerance for different points of view has dramatically declined over these past 20-some years. Back in law school, I was much more conservative than I am now. I would probably describe myself as a raging moderate these days. But back then, with the vigor of youth, I was sort of like a right-wing firebrand, and I was vice president of the Yale Federalist Society. And we hosted amazing debates about issues like affirmative action and marriage equality or same-sex marriage. And remember, I was in law school from 1996 to 1999. 1996 was when the Defense of Marriage Act was passed. So this was a very hot and very active issue. And we had great debates that I think changed people's minds, in both directions on these issues. I do not know if you could have, actually, I know you could not have some of those debates at Yale today. So let me actually talk about what's been going on at Yale. I've written about it extensively on my Substack, and there is a real hunger for these stories, actually. I think something like, so on your Substack, you can see on the right-hand column your stories listed by readership or traffic, and I think something like 8 or 9 of my top 10 right now are about law school free speech controversy. So on the bright side, people care about this issue, but it's sad that there's so much to write about. So some of you may have heard about this incident that happened last fall that has been dubbed Trap House Gate. This, I hear knowing laughter. This was a situation last September where a Native American law student named Trent Colbert sent out an email invitation to other members of NALSA, the Native American Law Students Association, inviting them to a Constitution Day party that was being co-sponsored by NALSA and the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society, incidentally, tried to co-sponsor it with the American Constitution Society, which is sort of like the Federalist Society of the left. But the American Constitution Society said no and decided to do some counter-programming about how the Constitution oppresses Native Americans. So, even though the Constitution is in its name. But anyway, in this invitation, Trent referred to his house, the house where he was holding this party, self-deprecatingly as the NALSA Trap House, by which he meant party house. I interviewed him for Original Jurisdiction, and he said, I thought trap house meant like frat house, but without the frat. Unbeknownst to him, some of his classmates viewed trap house as a very racist term. They went on to GroupMe, which is the messaging app where the members of the class communicated with each other, and they basically said that the term was synonymous with crack house, and as such was a, quote, a reference to the racist impact of both drugs and the war on drugs, as well as urban decay and redlining, and they argued that it was, quote, it represented, quote, inherently anti-black sentiment. As often happens in these situations, several students filed complaints with the Yale Law School administration, and Colbert was subjected to a series of meetings and phone calls where two administrators lectured him and pressured him to sign an apology that they had very conveniently drafted for him, that they wanted him to send out to his fellow students. They also made veiled threats about how this could possibly affect his reputation in the profession and also his bar admission. And you can listen to these recordings, they're online. The case has been written about quite extensively, initially by the Washington Free Beacon. Fire has written about it. One administrator told Colbert that the involvement in this trap house event of the Federalist Society, which is a mainstream conservative legal organization, which counts several Supreme Court justices as members or supporters, that the involvement of the Federalist Society was, quote unquote, triggering to some of the more left-leaning students who already felt oppressed by this gathering. To his credit, and with help from Fire and other organizations, Colbert did not back down, he did not apologize, and eventually Yale made clear that his speech was not going to be punished. But they could have done that when they met with him. At no point during these meetings and phone calls was Trent told that his speech was protected speech and he was not going to be punished. Instead, there was this veiled threat that if he didn't send out this apology, maybe he would find himself in significant trouble. So you would have thought that after the bad publicity from this, it was covered in CNN and the Washington Post, and even fairly liberal commentators like Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post were critical of Yale. I think she referred to the pre-written apology as Maoist. You would have thought that after this bad publicity, Yale would have learned a lesson, but alas, they did not. On March 10, the Yale Federalist Society held an event, ironically enough, about free speech, and it had two speakers from opposite sides of the political spectrum, Monica Miller from the American Humanist Association and Christian Wagner from the Alliance Defending Freedom, or the ADF. And ADF has taken a number of very conservative stances on issues relating to the LGBTQ plus community. And as a gay man myself, I'm obviously very opposed to pretty much all of those stances. But obviously, I think they were talking about Supreme Court litigation as part of this event, and Christian Wagner has argued and won multiple cases before the court on these issues, and it sounded like it was going to be an excellent event. Unfortunately, there was a protest. More than 100 students came into room 127 where the event was going to be held. And instead of just silently protesting or silently holding up signs, they began the event by trying to essentially shout it down. And one of the students, in sort of a distorted view of the counter-speech doctrine, when they were all yelling to drown things out, said, "This is our form of free speech," which is really sort of a perversion of the counter-speech doctrine that you're going to hear about, I'm sure, this weekend. So they were admonished by the moderator, Professor Kate Stith, and eventually they did leave for the hallway after they were reminded about Yale's free speech policy. But while out in the hallway, they continued to make noise, to shout, to stamp their feet, and to even sing happy birthday to one of the protesters whose birthday it was that day. And so even though the event was still allowed to go on, it was very difficult for people inside the room to hear, and they disrupted other events at the law school too, including 2 classes, several students who were taking self-administered exams, and a faculty meeting, a job talk, which had to be moved online. So this was obviously very disruptive and clearly a violation of Yale's free speech policy if you look at the examples of what constitutes disruption and violation of the policy online. But unfortunately, there was no immediate response from the Yale Law School administration, and we did not hear from Dean Heather Gerken until 2 weeks later. And she issued a statement reminding people about the free speech policy, but she claimed or suggested that the policy was somehow not violated because the event was not totally shut down, which is really a perverse interpretation of the policy. I mean, really, if the event was able to go on for just a few minutes, you could then say the policy was not violated. It just made absolutely no sense. Now, some of you, and by the way, these are just a couple of the scandals. There's also Dinner Party Gate and Anti-Racism Training Gate and FedSoc Gate, but I unfortunately, I'm standing between you and dinner, so I'm not going to belabor these. Now, some might say, well, this is just Yale Law School. This is just one law school. Why should we care? And I would offer at least two reasons. First, Yale is a very prominent law school, and since the inception of, well, for better or worse, the US News rankings, it has been the top law school, and many other law schools look to Yale as a model of how to run a law school and how to conduct legal education. Second, Yale trains a very high percentage of professors and deans of other law schools. In the past decade, 17%, so almost a fifth of US law professors hired have graduated from Yale. There are more than 200 ABA accredited law schools in the United States. One law school is responsible for about a fifth of the faculty. So the ideas and the mores and the values of Yale Law School are being spread to other law schools through these faculty members. Sadly, though, it is not just Yale that has a free speech problem. And again, I'm going to run through these incidents very quickly. Many of them are actually covered on the FIRE website, so you can research them more. I've also written about them on my Substack. Substack, by the way, aside, as many of you may know, I mean, it's a really great platform for those of us who are sort of like refugees from other organizations. Sort of like the management or owners of Substack have announced a very robust policy about in terms of how they're going to protect free speech and how they're not going to consider anything mildly offensive as violence or harassment or what have you. And as a result, I think you're seeing some great commentary on Substack, especially about issues of free speech. So, for example, in January, conservative legal scholar Ilya Shapiro, who was set to start as the executive director of the Constitution Center, the new Center on the Constitution at Georgetown Law, sent out a tweet criticizing President Biden's choice of now Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson for the Supreme Court. And the tweet, which was poorly worded, did cause a lot of blowback. The law school launched an investigation of Shapiro, and he was suspended or put on administrative leave, so he could not start his job. And there were a lot of calls for his firing. There were a lot of calls for him to be fired. What ended up happening was after a lengthy 4-month investigation, and again, these investigations, you didn't really need 4 months to investigate a single tweet. We all saw the tweet. We could all look at Georgetown's policies. The school absolved Ilya Shapiro of any wrongdoing, but on a technicality, they said, well, he hadn't officially started at Georgetown at the time that he sent the offensive tweet, and so therefore we are not going to discipline him. But they did go on at some length about the offensiveness of his tweet. And the problem with that, of course, is really what Dean Traynor should have said was this tweet, whether you agree with it or not, whether you support Justice Jackson or not, was protected speech under the policy. Ilya saw the writing on the wall. He kind of knew that if he stayed there, it would just be a matter of time before he got in trouble again. And so shortly after he was cleared, he actually left and is now a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Ilya also figures in another controversy on the other coast. On March 2, he was set to appear and speak at the UC Hastings Law School. But unfortunately, even though he flew all the way out there, he never got to speak. He was in a room, and there were a lot of protesters there. And whenever he tried to speak, he was drowned out. They shouted, they yelled, they made ad hominem attacks. One person mocked his baldness. They cursed at him. It was really a very, you can see this on YouTube or Instagram because one of the student organizations that was involved in organizing this protest was actually proud of their work in silencing Shapiro. So that event, unlike the one at Yale, truly was canceled because it never happened. Nobody ever said a word of substance, and nothing was done to allow this event to go forward. But it's not just on the coasts. In the South, for example, at Emory Law School, ironically enough, there's so many ironies in this. The Emory Law Free Speech Association was unable to win. Are you guys from there? Was unable to. Excellent. You guys do great work. was So this wonderful organization, which is all about student-run civil discourse, was unable to win official recognition because some members of the student community thought that it would, quote, likely give rise to a precarious environment because, oh my gosh, shocker, law students are talking about controversial issues without faculty babysitters, the horrors. And there were, quote, no apparent safeguards in place to prevent potential and real harm that could come from these discussions. Isn't this type of discussion why people go to law school? Fortunately, with the support of FIRE and also actually a former dean of Emory Law School, eventually in the spring, the organization finally won recognition. And then also, again, this is not just a coastal thing. In the Midwest, and this is a case that FIRE has been very involved in, University of Illinois law professor Jason Kilborn was investigated, suspended, and ordered to take a months-long sensitivity program. So you would say, well, what was his crime? On a final exam, he described a hypothetical employment discrimination scenario which referenced a racial slur and what the exam described as a profane expression for women. So he redacted the words on the exam, the N word and the B word. But redacting the words was not enough for him to escape discipline. Some students claimed that they were triggered or traumatized by this on the exam, and he was subjected to discipline. With the help of FIRE, he was initially able to work out a settlement with the law school administration, but after all this public pressure, the law school basically went back on its word, and unfortunately, Professor Kilborn had to file suit. Finally, just this month, American University concluded another long-running investigation that took more than a month, even though you could look at the transcript of the relevant chats, which are posted on the FIRE website, conducted an investigation that lasted more than a month into pro-choice students who, in a student forum, were criticizing the draft Supreme Court ruling in the Dobbs abortion case, which came out in May. And there was a conservative law student who claimed that he was harassed because of his political and religious views. But if you look at the transcript, you will look in vain for anything coming remotely close to harassment. I wrote a post about this for Original Jurisdiction, and I just sort of said that flat out. And my husband said, well, you should offer some support here. Can you basically describe the conversation? I just basically described the conversation. There was nothing there. I couldn't even say this was colorable possible harassment. There was nothing there. But it took them 43 days to figure that out. And these are just a few examples. Sadly, I could mention many, many more. And the point is not any individual scandal or controversy or professor or student. And we can all find some controversy where we might disagree with a speaker or disagree with the administration or what have you. The point is that American law schools are right now seized by a lot of illiberalism and intolerance. And for example, Kate Stith, who was one of my professors in law school, was the moderator of that March 10 event I mentioned. She told the Free Beacon in an interview, law schools are in crisis. The truth doesn't matter much. The game is to signal one's virtue. Similarly, another longtime law professor, Randall Kennedy at Harvard Law School, said that until recently, I thought fears of law schools becoming a liberal were overblown. I've changed my mind, said Professor Kennedy. I think that there's really a big problem. So now let's look at the consequences of this problem. Why should we care? Why does it matter? I think I'm talking about legal education, so there's a problem for the education part and there's a problem for the legal part. So in terms of law schools, there's a problem for the law part and a problem for the school part. I'll start with the school part first. It's a double whammy in terms of what we're getting at US law schools right now, because on the one hand, I'll quote former Emory Law Dean David Bartlett. I'm not at all a supporter of right-wing agendas or any other agenda, but I'm in support of people engaging in free speech and intelligent, cogent arguments around the issues of the day. If law students aren't encouraged to do this, there's something wrong with legal education. Or another one of my professors, Akil Lamar, commenting on the many Yale Law School controversies, I am not and have never been a member of the Federalist Society. But ideological diversity is important for challenging implicit bias, not just against members of other races, but those of other political persuasions. So let me talk about the education part of it. Education itself, whether it's law or medicine or the humanities, inherently involves different ideas, putting them out there, testing them in a crucible, sort of figuring out which ones will emerge. This is sort of a thesis, antithesis, dialectic dialogue. This is essential to all forms of education, not just legal education. But if you can't put out perspectives in a classroom, how is anyone going to learn? One professor at Yale Law School was saying that they no longer want to play devil's advocate because students think that the professor is taking that view and are sometimes offended. So this is a serious problem for education. The other thing about it, in terms of why it's a problem for education, is law itself is an adversarial system where you have different parties represented by different counsel arguing out before a judge or a jury. And if you can't have that form of argumentation in a law school classroom, you're doing a grave disservice to the future lawyers who are not going to be able to effectively represent their clients. So that's a problem with what's happening in terms of legal education. There's also a problem in terms of the legal profession. So many people thought, and this I think is also true of what you might see in, say, undergraduate institutions or business schools or medical or other institutions. Many people thought, well, these students who are so anti-speech and so intolerant sometimes, once they emerge in the real world, they will learn that they have to work with people of different views and they will moderate. But instead, what I think we are seeing, sadly, is the world is actually bending to these students. And in fact, you're seeing a lot of this in the legal profession. So the notion that you see on law school campuses about certain views being simply unacceptable is now hurting lawyers who are trying to do their jobs and represent controversial clients because it's threatening values of due process at the center of our legal system. Again, I do want to end fairly soon, so I would just refer you generally to a piece that Aaron Sabarium of the Free Beacon wrote for Barry Weiss's Substack, where he looked at how the ideas about speech from law schools are metastasizing throughout the legal profession. I'll just give you one quick example. Paul Clement, who's a very famous Supreme Court advocate, and his partner, Aaron Murphy, were partners at Kirkland & Ellis, which is the largest law firm in the world by revenue, very prestigious, very profitable. And they won a victory in the Bruin case about Second Amendment or gun rights in the Supreme Court. The day that that victory was announced, Kirkland announced that it would no longer handle Second Amendment cases, and it wasn't even grandfathering in or allowing existing representations to continue. It was going to withdraw from all of these representations immediately. And so Paul and Aaron had to leave Kirkland and start their own firm because Kirkland would not let them represent their clients with this unpopular view at the firm, especially in the wake of this high-profile Supreme Court victory. Sadly, this was not new for Paul because he had to leave a prior law firm, King & Spalding, in 2011 when he was hired by the House to defend the Defense of Marriage Act, and that became very controversial, and there was a whole blow-up over that. And he left, he went to a boutique, and then eventually he came back to a large firm in terms of Kirkland. But at the time that he left King & Spalding in 2011, there was a lot of praise for him. He was lionized. The New York Times wrote a staff editorial defending his standing up for his clients. The reaction this time around was a lot more muted, which is very telling. Yeah, sure, the Wall Street Journal editorial page wrote something, but really, the reaction was a lot more muted. I think a lot of people just kind of saw it as par for the course. So what can be done? In terms of administrators, there are a couple of things. I mean, I think words matter, and so I think it is wonderful that FIRE is encouraging many schools to adopt the Chicago principles, which are a ringing defense of free speech. But second, action matters, and I think there really has to be a zero-tolerance policy for students who violate free speech policy. It's certainly not the case at Yale, sadly. And then the third thing I think that law schools can do is just education, public awareness, what Greg opened his remarks talking about. If we're going to have trainings about, say, diversity, which I don't have a problem with, we should also have trainings, I think, about free speech and how to engage civilly with others. And then what can students do? This is where you come in. I think first you should speak out when there is a speech controversy on your campus. And I guess I'm preaching to the converted because you're all here for a weekend, obviously you care. But I would say that, sort of like that old slogan we had in the New York subway, if you see something, say something. I feel that there is a silent majority that is in favor of free expression, but it's often silent because people are afraid of being called various names if they stand up for free speech. Some people on the left like to use the term complicit. If you don't speak out against something, you're complicit in that evil. And well, this could be turned around and say that if you don't speak out against some harm to free speech, well, maybe you're complicit in that violation. Second, I would say help spread the word about FIRE and its work. Let people know that there are these resources. FIRE has come to the defense of many students and faculty who have found themselves in these pickles, and I think it's important for them to know that there is an organization out there that is going to be their champion. And then the third and final thing I would say is, and this is not just about free speech, but just generally for your educations, I would say try to take down the temperature. Try to be the adult in the room. Try to engage with your classmates in a civil and a good faith way, because right now there's a lot of trolling on both sides. There's a lot of anger on both sides, and I think we all just need to basically chill. One thing I will say, please do not file frivolous complaints with your administration when you feel that you have been offended by somebody. This actually just gets weaponized against defenders of free speech. There was an incident at the Stanford Federalist Society where a fire came to the defense of the student, where a student made satirical flyers making fun of FedSoc, as was his right. But members of the Federalist Society, which often is trying to say our speech rights are being violated, filed a complaint. I think that sometimes people think, oh, this is fun, it's jujitsu, we're going to kind of turn the complaint, we're going to weaponize the administration and the complaint process against them. And by the way, Professor Bazelon is going to talk a lot about Title IX in her remarks, which is a very important player in all this, because a lot of times schools say, well, we don't want to crack down on your speech, but our hands are tied because of this regulation or this law. But anyway, I would just say, please don't file frivolous complaints. They're only going to be used against us. So in conclusion, where do I come down? Maybe I'm a Pollyanna, but I'm actually an optimist about this. I speak at many law schools, and I think that students, professors, and administrators are getting a bit fed up. One challenge, of course, is getting people to say that they're fed up. I spoke at NYU Law School, and before my talk, one professor sort of sheepishly approached me and said, thanks for writing a lot about these issues. Like, I can't publicly take a stance, but I really appreciate your writing about it. I think that there are a lot of quiet allies of ours who feel that things have gone too far. But yes, I am an optimist. I do think that the fever will break. And one of the reasons I'm an optimist is to see a room full of you here to devote a beautiful summer, well, a little hot, but a beautiful summer weekend to learning about how to defend a speech on your campuses. So again, thank you to FIRE for having me, and thanks to all of you for the work that you're going to be doing in the years ahead. And yeah, I would love to take questions. And by the way, you can ask me about anything. I'm not just limiting it to my remarks here. Go ahead.
Oh, I have a microphone, actually,
sure.
if you don't mind. I'll run it over. Please say your name in school when you ask your question, and be brief and direct as possible with your questions so we can get to as many as possible.
Hi, I'm Scott. I'm an incoming law student at the University of Chicago. I was just wondering, so when, say, I'm going to be part of the Federal Society, and a lot of times we bring in controversial speakers, do we have an obligation to make space for not hecklers, but like protesters? And if so, do you have any mechanisms in mind that you think we should have, like, say, a dedicated row in the back for people with signs, whatever?
Yeah, so I think that non-disruptive forms of protest are totally fine, and most law school policies will allow for them. So for example, one form of protest that I've seen is people sitting in the room and silently holding up signs with various messages. The Yale free speech policy says the signs cannot obstruct the views of other attendees, so you can't just have a giant sign, but if you have a small sign that has a message on it, like, I think that's totally acceptable. I think it's totally acceptable for people to silently protest. I think these are all good ways of counter-protest, by the way, not trying to drown things out. I think you can have counter-programming at the same time as that event. So if the organization, if ACS, the American Constitution Society, wants to have counter-programming and counter-speech because you're inviting some judge who wrote an offensive opinion, well, they can do that. They can have their own classroom, their own forum at the same time to maybe siphon away people from your event, but they can do that. That is a totally legitimate form of counter-speech or protest. Also, I think it is fine to have a so-called walkout where people go to the event, take up all this room, make everybody think, wow, this is such a popular event, and then they all, at the start of the event, quietly process out. I think that that is also acceptable because you're not preventing anyone from speaking. Yeah, sure, maybe you take 2 or 3 minutes at the beginning, but everybody's like getting their food at FedSoc events anyway, so I think that is also totally fine. So I think a lot of times people say, when we complain about these situations, oh, well, you know, you're against protest, and there's a fine tradition of protest on American law school and college and university campuses. But I think that's absolutely the case, and I think FIRE has been a huge defender of that, actually. So I think it is really disingenuous or incorrect when people say that somehow we are trying to clamp down on people's rights of protest. FIRE is trying to stand up for those rights. It's just you have to protest in a way that is not going to drown out or impair the ability of the other side to speak. So anyway, Chicago, great law school. Yes, oh, wow, okay, why don't we go this way at this table? So you. Oh, sorry, the mic.
Cool. Hi, thank you for being here. From the students I've talked to on campus, their biggest fear is not necessarily free speech censorship from the university, but within the classroom with their professor. And so a lot of them will say that I have this view on this take, but on this opinion, or this opinion piece, I guess, but they're afraid to write about it in an essay or to say it in a Socratic seminar because they fear viewpoint discrimination from the professor within the classroom. What's a way out of this? Do they have any legal rights for them or a way that they can push back against this? Because it seems like they're getting pigeonholed a bit.
So that is, to be totally honest, that is a very difficult problem because law schools, basically many of them, especially Yale, treat their professors like kings. And it's great they have academic freedom, but at the same time, it's not uncommon for people to complain, wow, this is like people will warn you about this professor. They'll say, well, you know, if you go on the final exam and you take a position that is opposed to this professor's particular theory of the Fourth Amendment, well, you're probably going to get a lower grade than if you just take a position that is regurgitating his position. And unfortunately, there's not really much that can be done about things like that. Now, law schools and universities will have certain policies against being discriminated against based on something like political affiliation. American University, for example, which had that investigation recently, had such a policy. So I suppose if it really was that bad, you could do that. But really, it's a tough situation because professors do have a lot of latitude. You could try to go to the professor in office hours and see if you can say, look, professor, like I have this view and maybe I didn't want to say it in front of the whole class and maybe you disagree with it, but would it be okay if I articulated it? But it's a very difficult situation because, you know, you also don't want to trample on the academic freedom of the professor or prevent the professor from propounding their pet theory in class. That's what most professors do. So it is genuinely a very difficult issue. I'd be curious, maybe this is something that can be talked about this weekend if some of you and some of the speakers have other ideas on this.
Hello, thanks for talking with us. It was great. Zach Sluzala from University of Michigan. I wanted to get your take on one of the proposed solutions to this that's come out. I don't know how common it is in legal circles or law schools. I'm in neuroscience. I've seen it among my peers. I've also seen it in public health a little bit. But proposals for affirmative action programs, for whether it's for conservatives or for other political affiliations, that to attempt to balance out this lack of diversity of thought or diversity of ideology on college campuses. So yeah, just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
So personally, I would be very much in favor of efforts to promote viewpoint diversity. And occasionally you will see situations like this. For example, Yale has a fellowship that is not explicitly described as a conservative fellowship, but it's to promote diversity of thought. And the person who's going to be there now, Sai Prakash, is a right-of-center law professor. So you can have things like fellowships and professorships and other things that may be dedicated to this. One challenge, though, in general to this approach is just in terms of how universities are run. And the problem is a lot of these free speech problems also conflict with the ways the American university is structured and run, and that's a much harder thing to change. At least in law schools, faculty hiring is often done by the faculty. And so if you say you have a faculty of fairly left-leaning people who are also very confident in their ideas and very smart, and that's how they became law professors, if they hear somebody who's propounding the opposite theory, they may think, wow, this person is just plain stupid. And so as a result, they may not be inclined to think that that person is a good scholar, because how could an actually intelligent and diligent scholar reach this outcome? And they're not even doing this consciously. They're doing it subconsciously. And so I think it can be very, very difficult. So on the one hand, I do support these things, but in practice, it will be difficult because many faculties are sort of these self-perpetuating bodies. And if you already have an ideologically lopsided faculty, unless you have a faculty that really is open-minded and committed to ideological diversity, you're just going to get replication and more of the same. Oh, yep, go ahead. Oh, sorry, you and then you. But I promise I'll go to another table.
Hello, I'm Sahar Tartak. I'm a rising freshman at Yale. I'm wondering, procedurally speaking, how often these types of scandals or free speech issues make their way to court, when they get handled with the school administration. Like, how do these things just get navigated in the first place on a procedural, official level? Mm-hmm.
So what usually happens is there is some intra-university process. So it could be a student who's filing a complaint under, say, Title IX. It could be a complaint filed against a faculty member seeking discipline of that faculty. And then you may have administrative remedies. It has to sort of go through the university process. And there's a doctrine in law of sort of exhaustion of your administrative remedies. You got to go through the whole rigmarole at the university. But then after that, if your resolution is still unsatisfactory as it was in the case of Professor Kilborn, you can file a suit. So essentially, the long and short of it is you have to sort of fight that battle first at the university level, which is why internal regulations and Department of Education regulations, which again Professor Bazelon is going to talk about tomorrow, are so important, because this is sort of the first front of the battle. And by the way, we were just chatting about this earlier, the new Title IX regulations have just been issued for notice and comment, which is this period where the public gets to give their input on these new regulations, and they're going to be very important in terms of how universities handle these matters. So I would say pay a lot of attention to these regulations and pay a lot of attention to your own university's internal policies. One thing to note is that courts have held that handbooks and policies and things like that do represent a contract between the student and the university. You can sue on that. And so right now, another one of the scandals I didn't have time to talk about, Yale Law School is being sued by two students who claim that their speech rights were violated, and they are relying in part on Yale's free speech policy, which they claim, on Yale's anti-retaliation and harassment policy, which they claim was violated. One thing I will just say, again, it's not totally responsive to your question, but I will say this. There are so many things that happen at law school campuses that we never even hear about. They don't make it to FIRE, they don't make it to my blog, they don't make it to the newspaper, they don't make it to court. I spoke at the University of Cincinnati Law School a few months ago, and I heard about a huge dust-up, and it was not mentioned anywhere. This was the first I was hearing about it, and it's like my job to sort of follow this. And a lot of these things you never even hear about. So again, for those of you who are going to all these different campuses, Yale, Michigan, et cetera, if something like that is happening at your campus, like, give Greg and the crew, drop them a line, because, you can't combat what you don't even know is happening. Go ahead. You had a question, right? Oh, you can go to the, yeah, go ahead, and then I'll go to the back.
Yeah, I hope it goes to another table after this. Okay, I'll be quick. So just like you, or maybe you weren't, but I was baffled by the Paul Clement Bruin backlash situation, because for me, that he's a good lawyer. He's litigated something like 115 cases before the Supreme Court. So the intuitive logic for me would be like, he's a moneymaker. So you'd think that the firm motivated by profit is going to want to keep him. So my question for you is, as someone who observes the legal world, what is the cost to that firm, Kirkland & Ellis, of keeping someone like Paul Clement on that outweighs the money that he's going to bring in?
So excellent question, and I actually wrote a story on original jurisdiction, which you should all check out, davidlatt.substack.com. But I wrote about this, and it actually is more of a Kirkland and big law and law firm business story than it is a free speech story, but it actually has a free speech twist, which I'll bring in at the end. So Kirkland, this giant law firm, has been evolving. It used to be known as a litigation and mid-market private equity firm, but now it's getting bigger and bigger deals for bigger and bigger companies. It's making money hand over fist. It's the second most profitable law firm in the country, and they have a number of large corporate clients who do not like gun work. And after Uvalde, after the horrific shooting in Uvalde, a lot of companies heard about Kirkland's work on these gun cases and reached out to their partners who handle their corporate deals and said, we are not comfortable with you handling this litigation. So that is essentially what happened. Kirkland has been gradually evolving from a litigation firm to a transactional or corporate firm, and Clement is very profitable. He has a book of business probably in the tens of millions, but if you collectively think of all of Kirkland's private equity clients, which is, they have business in the hundreds of millions or more. So it was in Kirkland's economic interest to actually let him go, despite his individual practice being profitable. Here's the free speech twist. Corporate America is becoming an increasingly illiberal place, and it is corporations that are leaning on their law firms to drop some of these controversial representations. And so that's a whole other kettle of fish. There was a question in the back.
Hi, my name is John from University of Kentucky. I'm actually a physician studying at the College of Public Health, so I appreciate all the lawyers in here. You do great work, but I thought maybe we could talk about my profession for a bit. Because we are a very academic profession. We need to be able to talk about controversial and difficult issues and new evidence as it emerges, but we can't. And unlike the law students, we are completely ineffective advocates for ourselves. We don't know what the First Amendment is. And frankly, we are all very scared because we have bigger loans than you do. We have 8 different layers of bureaucracy imposing ideological conformity down on us. And if we can't talk about these issues, it's not some hypothetical people die. So what countervailing force do you imagine in my area?
So that is a great question, and unfortunately, I was basically just going to pile on to your comment about how bad it is. For some of you who may not know, I had a very serious case of COVID-19 in March 2020. I was sort of like poster boy for the early days of the pandemic, and even though I'm a relatively young and healthy person, I wound up spending 3 weeks in the hospital, including a week on a ventilator, and I had a very, very serious case of COVID. And I very much believe in masks and medicine and not Clorox and things like that. At the same time, I was very troubled by efforts on Twitter and other social media platforms to silence alternative points of view. Let's have a debate about masks. Let's have a debate about hydroxychloroquine, which the peer-reviewed studies show is useless. Like, if we are confident in our data, let's have that debate. So I just hope that medicine, which is a very, better than law, it's a very evidence and science and data-based field. I just hope that that thinking will prevail in your field. And the other thing is, the stakes are high. As you mentioned, people are going to die. And I think if you start seeing suboptimal patient outcomes because of some things that are not being discovered or not being talked about, that's a big problem. Again, to go back to Greg's opening remarks, we have to have some kind of humility. What might look like the state-of-the-art treatment today might be a terrible treatment tomorrow, or vice versa. And so I guess I'm discouraged to hear about what's going on in medicine, and I don't have a great solution for you. Maybe someone this weekend will. Go ahead. Oh, and somebody please stop me. I don't know when I'm supposed to stop, so if someone can like wave at me or something. Okay, thank you.
Hey, hello. So my name's Sam. I go to the Emerson College over in Boston, and so like I wanted to know. I know that that the private universities, they are not bounded by the First Amendment. However, what if a university has a statement supporting freedom of speech, right? And then let's suppose that they infringe on my speech, which happened in my case. And then I want to sue them. First of all, what charges can they bring against them? Second, how tough a case would be? And then third, if it's not a good case, what are some other ways I can publicly shame my college for being a bunch of censors?
Well, you're obviously in the right place. There are a lot of really good lawyers who litigate campus speech issues in this room. But going to what I was saying earlier, luckily, we don't have criminal laws relating to speech. It's not a criminal action, but you could bring a contract action against your school saying, look, they have this policy set forth in their handbook. Yale has the Woodward Report, which is kind of their version of the Chicago principles, and that courts have held as a binding contract between the student and the university, because when you pay that ginormous amount of tuition to your university and these policies are online and available to you, the assumption that you are making as the purchaser of this education is that the university is going to comply with those policies. So you can bring a contract suit. I will say, and again, the fire lawyer is going to know a lot more about this than I do, because they are in the trenches of litigation. There are not a huge number of these suits, and I don't know why. I mean, maybe some of them are getting solved at the university level, but it could also be that, and this is also what you see generally in lawsuits, people don't necessarily want to be known as the person who had that lawsuit. Like, people don't want that to define them. And so that's why sometimes it can be challenging to find a plaintiff for some of these cases, because they're controversial. And if you are the plaintiff in some controversial speech case, when someone Googles you, that's going to be like the first thing that comes up. And maybe some employer or maybe some person you want to date is not going to like that years down the road. And that's why people can be scared. And so that's why one of the important things fire does is it finds these cases, but it also finds plaintiffs, because you can't have a lawsuit without a plaintiff. So I'm not quite sure that answers your question, but I think it's kind of in the ballpark. Go ahead. In the back, yep, thank you.
Hey there. My name is Michael Reed Price. I'm from Emory University, part of the Emory Free Speech Forum. So my question is, the reason we decided to make a free speech club is because we had a little bit of a speech issue, and it essentially came down to you are either a homophobe or there was, 6 of us in the whole law school who decided to be so you were a homophobe or you go with the grain. It was this total groupthink. And my question is, advice for going against the grain, advice for when it seems like it's contagious. The anti-free speech is just catching on to everyone, and we had a walkout at our school, which seemed to feature about 80% of the students. How do you go against the grain when there is that serious groupthink?
So that, again, is a really huge problem. But I will say that you are doing one thing right. The one standard piece of advice I often give when I speak at law schools, for example, is you need to find support in each other. There is safety in numbers. If you speak out about something, but you're not the only one, that is going to be so much better. So it's a wonderful thing that you have founded the Free Speech Forum, and there are other organizations as well. Honestly, and I have some issues with the Federalist Society, and I've written about them actually, but at many law schools, the Federalist Society is actually a good organization if you are right of center for finding support on these issues, because again, given the overall left-leaning orientation of legal academia, it's often the Federalist Society where people who are these dissenting voices can find support. So you really need to find support from each other. There are also, hopefully, faculties are more diverse than Yale's. There may be other professors who diverge from groupthink who can also be supporters of yours. And again, because law schools treat professors like royalty in many ways, it is really important sometimes to have that faculty sponsor. So I'm glad that the former dean, for example, was in your corner. Because one of the things, and this is a problem as to why law school faculties are so non-diverse, and going to your question about affirmative action, we all know about the Overton window, right? That sort of window of what's acceptable discourse. And the problem is, if you have no conservatives or libertarians or non-super progressives on your faculty, that window just shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. And so it really is hard for you to keep the window open. The other thing I would say, just generally, is and this is not really for maybe folks in this room, but also for the people on the other side, like, people do need to get a thicker skin. Look, I'm Asian American, I'm gay, I've been called like numerous epithets. I had an aunt who, maybe she still thinks this, who thought my marriage was a big sin, and she tried to get all these other relatives to not go to it, and I think she may think still that, I'm going to burn in hell, whatever. But we have to have confidence in our convictions. I don't think I live a sinful lifestyle. Why should I be concerned about what Auntie Lovey thinks? And, we were estranged, our family, we were kind of estranged from her for a while because my parents took it very personally too, and she was trying to dissuade other relatives from coming to our wedding. But eventually we reconciled. And look, we haven't changed her views on this, and she's not going to change ours. But I wanted to see my cousins again. And, Auntie Lovey, aside from this issue, she's actually a very nice person. And we just need to somehow bridge these gaps and realize that we can have totally divergent views maybe that even you might find abhorrent, but we have to find a way to get along and to put these things aside. People are not just the sum total of their opinions on 5 hot button issues. And the other thing I will say, and again, look, there are resources out there. If you are suffering from a mental health issue because you feel disparaged, there are universities are doing a lot better job than they did in my day about mental health resources. So don't be afraid to seek counseling and to get help when you do need it. Or people on the other side, if they're feeling oppressed because you held an event, well, there are resources for them too. So I think really people do need to A, get thicker skins, and B, learn how to live with people with views that you find maybe totally abhorrent. Go ahead.
Let me ask you the other side of this. You talked about Yale. What universities or law schools do you think are on the positive side of the free speech issue?
Yep.
And do a pretty good job. Chicago's the class.
Yes, you stole my answer.
So,
Yep.
So take that one away.
Yeah. So, I do want to give some props. I don't want to be total Debbie Downer. So, Hastings, I talked about how the Ilya Shapiro event was shut down. And look, maybe there should have been some discipline of those students. But Dean David Fagman, the very next day, sent a very strongly worded school-wide letter saying that what happened to Shapiro was unacceptable and reiterating the school's policy. It was much better than what happened at Yale, where we had 2 weeks of silence, and then we had this mushy statement that tried to sort of gaslight us into thinking. Sorry. This is Hastings, UC Hastings on the West Coast. So Dean Fagman sent this very strongly worded statement where he admitted that the policy was violated. So that was a positive action. Another school where I think people did stand up, and maybe there is a change in attitudes, hopefully, or a line we're finally reaching, is at George Washington Law School, GW in Washington. Justice Thomas teaches as an adjunct. And this is an amazing opportunity for students to learn about Supreme Court opinions from a freaking Supreme Court justice. But lo and behold, after Dobbs, there was a petition issued to basically cancel his class, total cancel culture. They wanted to cancel his class, revoke his teaching privileges because of his horrific opinion in Dobbs. And this opinion got something like more than 7,000 signatures. And there was a lot of pressure on the university. But the provost and the dean basically said, nope, not going to do it. Justice Thomas is saying, thanks for your input. So I think, law school administrators need to get backbone. But this is what you as students can do, and you as lawyers at FIRE, you can help fortify that backbone.
We have time for one last question.
Right over here.
My name is Charlotte Hardy. I attend the first HBCU, Lincoln University of Pennsylvania, and I have experience working in my student senate where we, as students, help faculty and administration pass laws for freedom of speech and student rights. So my question to you, in your professional opinion, as a student who is an undergraduate who is working towards their own degree while also tasked with helping students in their college journey, to be the best way to advocate not only for me, but for them as well.
For faculty members to be involved in, say, the faculty senate. So I would say, again, get involved. And also, going to a question which maybe I didn't fully answer, I think the publicity can be a very powerful thing. And I think that is a weapon or a tool that you should not be afraid to use. Reach out to FIRE. Reach out to me if you have some connection to the legal world, at least. davidladd@substack.com. Just email me. I very much want to hear about these stories, and I want to shed light on them because, again, as I mentioned earlier, there are I hear every time I go to law school, there are so many affronts to free speech and academic freedom that we never even hear about. And so Justice Brandeis famously said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So we need to shed sunlight on these problems. And you, as students who are committed to this, you are really in such a wonderful position to do that. And so, again, thank you for having me, and thank you for all of your amazing work.
David.